Hey, everybody. This is the Raptors weekly podcast slash check in slash whatever, because the Raptors have hired a new coach, Darko Rajakovic. If anybody wants to understand how he got to this point, how he became the Raptors head coach, we will detail it a little bit later. By the time you're listening to this, I may very well be sitting in or across from Masai and Darko, getting ready to ask them all sorts of questions at his introductory press conference. And there will probably be more coverage of his hiring afterwards. But Louis Zatzman and myself have both spent the past couple days looking into Darko's beliefs, spoken and written about his history as a coach, and kind of looked into some of the numbers so we can compare and contrast where he's been as a coach, what he's been able to implement, and the testimonials that have been documented by his past players he's coached, by some of the people I know in the league who I asked around to say, hey, what do you guys think of them? And just, what's been covered. Lewis, quick, how are you doing?
I am doing wonderful. Very excited to be here, chat with you. This has been months in the making. We've been sitting anxiously waiting for this. So very excited to be here.
Liminal spaces and the like. How do you feel about the wait? I remember I was listening to Blake's Blue Jays podcast, and there were probably 4 or 5 times where guests from other cities who also, they're baseball workers, they cover baseball, but they're also like, hey, what's going on with the Raptors in basketball? They don't have a coach yet. What did
Yep.
you think about that process, the hiring process, as it were?
I don't think there was any competitive advantage lost. The Raptors weren't really going to hire anyone who got hired elsewhere. It is quite telling that Nick Nurse and Adrian Griffin both are head coaches of other teams. That's probably a podcast for another time. But the Raptors didn't lose anything by it, but the fans definitely lost sleep, lots of anxiety, being in a liminal space, as you said. So at the very least, we can be more comfortable now in that we have resolution to something that was anxiety producing.
So, just for everybody who is visiting this podcast as your first stop to learn about the Raptors' new head coach, I'll walk you kind of through what I've learned about Rajakovic, and then this will be built upon throughout the podcast. We're hoping that this seems more so like a deep dive rather than a like, hey, this happened, relative to what you've been reading or hearing. Fingers crossed for that. But basically, Rajakovic, he started playing basketball when he was 7 years old in Serbia. The fun quote is that in my country, you start following basketball from the day you were born. I thought that was a great one. That's from an interview he did with the Tulsa 66ers like in 2012 that I found on YouTube. I was digging the same way I imagine many people listening to this were. He quit basketball at 16, thinking, I don't have the juice. I can't make it as a pro. Let me get into coaching. Did so immediately. Immediately started coaching youth basketball, stayed there for some time, then got a promotion after the coach for Belgrade, under 16, under 18 youth basketball in Serbia moved on. He became the head coach. He worked there. Then he went to the fourth tier of the Spanish division, Espacio. Then, and actually during his time there, from 2004 to 2011, he was an assistant coach at Summer League for the San Antonio Spurs, and he was also a scouting consultant for them. On top of that, Lute Olson, he spent time at the University of Arizona learning under him. He also was with Mike Krzyzewski. I can't remember how to. Coach K at Duke in 2008. He spent time there. He's been close with some of the big coaching moguls that, of modern history. And then he gets, the big leap across the pond to the Tulsa 66ers, where he starts his head coaching job. He's in the G League, as we've mentioned, a similar trajectory to Nick Nurse in that regard. He spends time coaching summer league teams. He reveres and revels in the little things about coaching. He eventually makes the jump to an assistant coach with the Thunder. Has some success there, coaches their summer league team in 2015 and 16, if I recall correctly. Then he gets plucked to Phoenix. Then he gets plucked to the Grizzlies. In 2021, he coached the Grizzlies summer league team. Then finally, after all of this, ends up in Toronto. Big picture stuff, Lewis. Any thoughts on the guy who, per sources, is believed to be able to, if the Raptors choose to rebuild, can develop and coach guys up and take his time, or if they retool and try and come back and compete, can handle a roster that has higher ambitions for the next couple seasons.
We're going to be talking a lot about how we can parse his X's and O's, how he might run a team. We're going to talk about his player development. We're going to talk about both sides. I do think one thing that's really interesting is the Raptors seem to have been adding people with a path in Masai Ujiri's image in a lot of ways. Unique roots to the league. Over and over and over again, we keep seeing this in players, in players and coaches, front office staff. Ujiri had a unique path to the league. Bobby Webster in many ways, Nick Nurse did, and now Rajakovic. Again, these are not people coming through the traditional system, nor are players, right? The AAU system. That's not what the Raptors have been building their team around. That seems like the team thinks they've identified a real advantage in finding people and players from unique paths from different areas of life. And this is just one more example of that. It does make for better writing. I'm really excited to write about the guy because it's just not something that you'll read about other people in the NBA. So a lot of fun and remarkable. How often do you have someone who didn't play in the NBA, coached in the fourth league in Spain? This is really cool stuff that he's here with the Raptors. Very excited.
To hammer down on the history of it, he's only the second ever head
Yeah.
coach in the NBA who's been European born. That's not common, obviously, seeing as he's number two. You wrote about it. You've already done, like we've both done deep dives. Some of the
Yeah.
things we've uncovered will be, you hear it throughout this podcast. But in your deep dive, did anything immediately jump out to you as like, this is interesting? Or maybe because everybody was learning things about him rapidly on Twitter, as most people do, everybody was aggregating the same stuff. What jumped out to you is like, I wouldn't have guessed that. And what jumped out to you is like, that seems like it fits.
Uh, Interesting. I don't know if I have specific answers to what I would have expected because I'm not sure if I had expectations.
Sure.
Uh, but I think the thing that probably stood out the most is he has really laid out his offensive philosophies in a lot of way. So obviously the Chris Oliver podcast, Basketball Immersion, that we've all listened to at this point. He also had a Q and
The backbone of
yeah,
the coverage from
the
the Toronto
entire
market.
market.
Everybody
He also
got
had a
their
Q and
stuff
A
from there.
with Global Stars Basketball. You linked both when you dropped the news on Raptors Republic, and he went really deep in a way that I've never really read from head coaches in the NBA. So just to lay it out briefly, and I'm sure you'll have more insight than I do. Um, Motion offense guy, free flowing offense, empowers players, point five, quick decisions. He wants structure as a means of letting players improvise their own structure. So big creates small in a way. Do you think there's other like big picture descriptors of how he runs offense?
So he is very technical in approach.
Yeah.
So technicality off court, promoting that to players on court for an organic aspect of it. So like he wrote, an article. This is big. Hey, he's like me moment for you and I. He wrote an article on the, proliferation and evolution of the pick and roll at the NBA level, co-written by Quinn Snyder. And a lot of it is hyper technical about quadrants on the floor, spaces on the floor,
Yeah.
angles of screens, and what this means and what types of advantages can be garnered. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but that is the thing, is that in that piece he mentions sometimes even before we laid out basketball in this hyper specific technical way, the things we identify as like, hey, this was an advantage, maybe we do it here, you can go back in the tape and say, Tony Parker was doing this with San Antonio, only it wasn't laid out in these specific technical terms. Players create and players
Yeah.
innovate without the technicalities. What he's doing is saying, I'm going to lay out these advantageous layers on the floor. I'm going to say, when this happens, and I'm going to look in the film for when our players do something that seems advantageous and see when these things cross over. Basically, just like be a huge nerd and try and lay everything out super technically, and then allow the film to kind of give you feedback on your thoughts there. And that is really hard work on a coach's behalf. And then again, humanizing and belief in your players to allow them to override that and show you all the things you may have missed.
And on that second point, the biggest standout to me, if I had to describe one quality of him as a coach that I think is probably most important for the Raptors, it was on that Global Stars basketball Q&A. He was asked why he likes a free-flowing offense, because the best offense in the league, or one of the best, was the ISO offense in Houston with James Harden, right? This was a few years ago. And he said he likes free-flowing offense, dynamic offense, because that's what he thinks players prefer. He doesn't have ideological precepts that he is going to pin on people top down. He believes in structure, he believes in advantages, but the reason why he believes in those structures and advantages is because it's what makes players happiest, most comfortable, and as a result of happiest, most comfortable, most successful. To me, that's why he's considered a player's coach. And we're going to get into a lot of things about players coach, but the biggest takeaway for me is all of these ideological components in the pick and roll and motion offense, they're because of players, not because of his brain.
Right. And I think that we'll discuss this in like the comparing and contrasting elements of Nurse and Darko as far as, there's a lot of similarities there,
Yeah.
both in their path to the NBA and in what they're hoping to implement. A lot of the ideals, and this is the exciting thing about getting a new coach, is especially a guy like Darko who has put out so much public work. And how many coaches can you really, as soon as they got hired, go to a 2 hour interview where they're just answering all the smallest basketball minutia? Or if there's a podcast by a really great source for people who want to learn about coaching and coaching young men, young women, young people about basketball, like Basketball Immersion, you get an hour and 15 minutes from Darko and Chris about implementing offense, wherein he describes with film how they did it in Phoenix and talks about how the players reacted to it. Like, this isn't that common. So what
No.
that does create is a bunch of info for fans to be like, well, this is all good. He's going to just make this happen in Toronto. We'll kick the can down the road a little bit about why that might be difficult. Rubber meets the road. But the number one thing, the number one difference between Nurse and my earnest hope for Darko is that Nurse, by the end of it, I think a lot of it was lip service in like publicly in media. Nurse can be on a podcast in Vegas last year and say, no, like guys get to do whatever they want. I want to see them get paid. If you get the rebound, you get to run offense. And he gets to position himself as a player's coach. That doesn't mean it's true. And the
Yeah.
players have to connect with what he's saying. And the players have to feel like they're valued. And I just want to put that out there that it has to be the hope for the Raptors organization and for Darko as he gets there and starts communicating with the players, implementing offense, defense, that he's able to communicate it more effectively than Nurse had been over the past couple of years. I'll leave you to answer so much of what I said there.
Everybody and their grandmother, when you ask them what coaches need to offer, they're going to say coaches are service for players. That's a direct quote from
Well,
Rajakovic,
there's
right?
there's a
Coaches,
there's a demographic that will not say that. Players are chess pieces. Coaches are big brain geniuses.
we want them to say coaches need to be service for players. We've got to listen, right? That's what he said. We've got to listen. But not every coach is going to have their own brand on their own hat that they wear.
Sure.
I really don't think Rajakovic is going to have a DK, cool initials, a DK branded hat that he wears to media. That's my
Probably not.
take on, is he a player's coach? I think he is probably more likely to um, have actions that match those precepts.
Let's table that quickly. You wrote a piece about building
Yeah.
around Scottie Barnes. What does that look like? I am the self-proclaimed Scottie Barnes expert for how much film I've watched of him and kind of poured over it for hyper-specific reasons. And we have learned a lot about Darko recently. I want to start off with you. What are your hopes for Scottie plus Darko? More so what it means for Scottie than the other way around.
Yeah, so and I think a lot of it is going to be similar to the piece. I want his touches to go up, and I want where his touches are coming to be different. A lot of his touches in his first 2 years in the league came from outside the 3 point line, and there's almost no advantage to be created there. He's not a rapid decision maker outside the 3 point line, even though he is a rapid decision maker inside it. He doesn't do a lot of stampede cuts. He's not elite at driving against a set defense. His strengths come elsewhere. The Raptors have not given him the ability to harness those strengths. And look, he's still been great. Like in an uncomfortable situation, uncomfortable in that it's the team's not built around his image, and it shouldn't have been. But in that situation, he's still been a really helpful, productive player. But I think he can be a lot better than that, and a lot of the offensive principles that Rajakovic discussed, point five, and really emphasizing spacing and having a lot more options for players, dynamic options. All of that is exactly what Barnes needs to be unlocked. Um, Now, you talked about where the rubber meets the road, and I think it's really important that he wants to empower players. What if the players on Toronto's roster don't want to cut super hard? What if they want to isolate? And I think that's a really important question. What if Barnes likes touching the ball outside the 3 point line? That may not be what looks best to us, but guys might have different feels and comfort zones. And it's very possible that our idea of the ideal way to unlock a player and Rajakovic's principles may be in line, but how players want to play might differ. So we are going to see what really where the overlap is.
Why isn't Giannis as good as a roller as Anthony Davis, despite having
Yeah.
a lot of these similar advantages? It's just like guys want to do different things.
Yeah.
Now, there is a lot of hope in looking at what Scottie is really good at and what he has been really good at, despite, as you mentioned, being the author of his own usage so far in his NBA career. There's a lot of hope in seeing how Pascal Siakam, for example, I know there's trade rumors. I know there's a hope to move up to grab Scoot Henderson if that's available. I know that the team is in flux, but to run the hypothetical, Pascal's back, you can look at he was a point 0.5 player.
Yeah.
He was that guy who
Yeah.
was
Big
like,
time.
I'm going to make a killing working off of other dudes. I'm going to be the guy who works hard in all the little parts of the offense. And despite now becoming a major isolation hub, you can harken back to that isn't where his, the personality of his game got its start. And he's gotten much better individually with a bunch of different skills that you say, maybe this can work better in a system that is less about isolation and less about, having kind of pack line defense played against them, a little bit more 5-on-5 instead of 1-on-3 or something like that. That's the hope. Fred VanVleet, there's a lot of aggregators who are using slippery language to report that he's gone. I will say he's declined his option because he has a much larger payday coming. Maybe fans want him back, maybe they don't, but that isn't decided yet. The stuff that's coming out, I will say, seems like it's largely um, it's media. Players use their means and the tools, the mechanisms at their that they can use to manipulate and kind of bump up their earning potential. Teams do the same thing. Free agency is still about a month away. We'll see what happens. Fred
We're a
is
long way
also
away. Yeah.
Fred is also a guy who was not like heavy touch time, was this like little engine that could you just put him on the weak side and have him shake up next to a pick and roll, and that was useful, and he'd run and sprint off of handoffs and stuff like that. There's with the talent on the roster, there's stuff to be gained. The thing I want to talk about really quickly is kind of with structure, building spacing. And I want to talk about one thing in particular because when I was talking about this with Caitlin Cooper and Evan Gualberto, about, hey, how does coaching impact this
Yeah,
stuff? And Caitlin starts describing like, hey, there's this action, and what happens if the split doesn't equal anything? And what happens if the team starts playing way over onto the strong side? And what happens if you don't have the shooters to make them pay on the weak side? And what happens if nobody moves when you run actions? That's a real possibility. Rajakovic can preach as much as he
yeah,
wants. If they don't enter a positive feedback loop, then that means that plays will break down. It will be more so about like, go get us a bucket. The structure thing, and this is a specific thing I heard him talk about, was utilizing the 45 extended instead of the baseline more specifically. And this also intersects with something that Caitlin Cooper talked about, where she was looking when I said, hey, the Raptors, what kind of offense would you want to run? She's like, you build it around the pick and roll, obviously, but it's very important that you constantly have one of Pascal or Scottie, if those are the guys you want to build around, above the break. And so what I'm imagining here, for anybody, this maybe is a little bit heady and, I don't have a play exactly for it, but if you run a pick and roll and you have a guy who is above the break, one pass away, that means that their defender can step over into the lane to block up a driving lane. What that means is that driving lane for the pick and roll handler won't be as available. But what it does mean is that if it's Pascal above the break and you are doing the point 0.5 principle and the pass goes out, you can have an edge where the guy in the corner spaced out and Pascal Siakam can probably have either a 2-on-1 or a 2 on
yeah,
1.5 if the ball goes down quickly. You have
yeah,
to shift the defense without making them fear, the shooting a lot. And Rajakovic has preached about using the 45 as a better place for cutting in the offense because there's more fruit to bear there, and how the 45 is a better place to drive because it means you have the middle and the baseline. This runs counter to what the Raptors have been doing the past couple of years, wherein they've had less people above the break to pursue offensive rebounding. That is a complete switch. And I'm curious, Lewis, what you think about that.
I love all that. Yeah, you can turn that. The Raptors left a lot of meat on the bone with the way that they were defended. Because if everyone is gapping, you have a ton of opportunity to turn that into stuff that's not just a catch and shoot jumper for a bad shooter.
Yep.
When Scottie Barnes, for example, was getting dropped insanely deep by Miles Turner and then a bunch of centers after him, he turned that into a lot of zoom actions on the weak side with Gary Trent, right? That was awesome. That type of stuff, I think, is very available and should work really well with Rajakovic's principles. As to the 45 versus the baseline, so it's funny. I was actually in the comment section today on just my quick little piece about Rajakovic. I was asked what I meant when I called the Raptors over the past few years technologically inept. And what I think this is a piece that I've been toying in my head
It
with
was
for a
because they
while.
they didn't have the Noah board yet, naturally.
No, well, yeah, I think the Raptors have been technologically innovating in the wrong direction, not just Noalytics as a money laundering scheme, but also in terms of how you're manufacturing offense. They've innovated through possessions, which I think is kind of not correct in terms of modernity. And I think the last few years, the NBA has shown with this huge offensive boom, cutting to me the last 2 years is defined as much by cutting as by anything else in terms of what is driving offense. Cutting is the I see this is a piece I need to write. Cutting,
Well, quickly, just to give you like a really good place to parallel, you wrote about Luca and Kyrie actually being perfect partners. There's no
yeah,
way you wrote that piece without running into Josh Green film.
that's right. That's exactly right. When you want to match guys around players, Shooting obviously pairs well, but the other thing that pairs just as well in all elements is well-timed cuts. And it's just so much for spacing in a lot of different ways than shooting, right? Because you provide spacing inside or out. And Steph, I wrote this piece about his cutting when he won the most recent championship. The Warriors were better without him having the ball. That's crazy. That's so unlikely for the greatest pull-up shooter in league history, right? And it's just because he's also one of the best cutters. And for him, he can cut away from the rim instead of towards the rim both ways, draw the defense, just crazy spacing advantages. But to bring that to the Raptors, um, you could have a lot more advantages gained from that 45 in terms of off the ball. OG Anunoby made a lot of hay last year, which you wrote about the specific play, that lob um, that Pirtle was throwing to him out of horns and other sets.
Yeah.
Uh, but that's kind of the only way you can make money as a baseline cutter. There's a lot more from above the break. Precious Achiuwa made a ton of great plays as a cutter. Scottie Barnes, also some very good ones. Pascal Siakam, not as frequent, but one of the league's most efficient finishers on a cut. The Raptors have cutting talent. They didn't create a situation to prioritize it and to unlock it. And I'm hoping that by shifting things around, by prioritizing the above the break rather than the baseline, that should, in theory, turn cutting into a more weaponized ability for the team, and as a result, modernize the team offense.
This is something that the moment that Darko joined the Suns, as you we were kind of looking into, their pick and roll frequency dropped, and they started running out of Chicago. And so pick and roll frequency can drop, and you can still get a lot of the advantages of the pick and roll, provided you're running dribble handoff. And the Raptors, one of their favorite plays to run late was just stacking a Chicago action with their best players. And there was a particular game against Detroit where
Yeah,
Pascal back cutting with a drawn out defense, despite there not being a ton of shooting, was extremely potent, provided that Jakob could make that high-low pass to him. The Raptors, if you had told somebody that, hey, this team doesn't shoot very well, but they're really big, they have, if you look at Scottie, if you look at OG, if you look at Pascal, you'd say incredibly elite finishers across the wing and size. Most people wouldn't have said, oh, I guess they're getting a lot of offensive rebounds. Most people
yeah,
probably would have said they probably do a lot of cutting. And
yeah.
that just wasn't the case. There's a lack of motion. And so it's that, yes, isolation can be viable. This is also something that Darko wrote about, is that you always have the isolation in the back pocket. You can always go to that. That's also a benefit of spacing above the break, by the way. You don't isolate from the corner. You isolate from above the break so that when you collapse the defense, you have more options open to you. The Raptors can go to that more often. It has to be a little bit more intentional about getting the buy-in from five different guys. Blake always talks about this, conversations he had with CJ Miles, who he was pretty close with when he was on the team, is
Yeah.
carrying the advantage and making sure that you buy in from different spots on the court so that there is danger everywhere, so that teams have to defend in a team concept, not against one guy, but against five guys. And being able to do that and utilizing the length is so important. People who listen will play pickup. You know how much more difficult it is when the 6'1" guy who likes to dribble a lot and has an okay jumper when you play basketball decides, like, I'm gonna make a ton of basket cuts. You feel that. See, it's really, you do.
Yeah.
And while it's not exactly the same at the NBA level, it's it carries. The guys who are big and can finish well, catching on the move towards the basket, there are going to be counters. Guys are going to step up, passes will have to be made, but on the whole, it's going to be something that bears fruit. Now, you do have to play around with the restrictions of spacing. We'll see what that looks like as the roster kind of fills out. But just as something that he's preaching offensively, from what I've read, his piece on the pick and roll, from what I've listened to, like 6 hours of podcasting at this point or interviewing, I do believe that this guy, considering he's gotten buy-in from a multitude of stars and different types of stars, and this is something that these players have talked about, I believe that he will be able to get it in Toronto. Offensively, I think that maybe points per possession, because they didn't end up in a horrible place at the end of the season. I'm not so sure that it's going to be like a world of difference, but I think it'll look a lot better. And I think
Yeah.
it will take less effort from a couple guys to get to that point.
In the fourth quarter, we'll have better points per possession. And the points per chance is going to go up, which is, to me, a more important indicator. The Raptors may have biased me against second chance points, but when I'm looking at offense, I look at first shot half court offense as the most important indicator. Um, just to step back a moment about the pick and roll, people may not. The league has evolved so much in the last couple of years. It is not. It's still a pick and roll league. Don't get me wrong, but it is much less a pick and roll league than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. And just to make this case, this past season, the regular season, 30th in pick and rolls per game, Sacramento Kings, which is the best offense statistically in league history. 29th, the Golden State Warriors. 28th, the Denver Nuggets. 27th, the Milwaukee Bucks, one of the championship favorites all year. 26th, the Memphis Grizzlies. Like, these are elite offenses, right? Boston Celtics also in the 20s. Go up to the top, you have Phoenix and you have Philadelphia, really good teams. But then you have Chicago third, Detroit fourth, Charlotte fifth, Houston sixth. The worst teams in the league. Ran the most pick and rolls. And even though, Rajakovic has a, treatise on the pick and roll, his teams dropped in pick and roll when he joined them. And we don't know to what extent that it dropped in frequency. They all went up in efficiency, I should add. They dropped in frequency. Even though we don't know to what extent that's the assistant coach versus the head coach, that's really promising for the Raptors because they are not going to be a Phoenix Suns style 100 pick and rolls a game, good offense is the result. And I don't think the league is that either right now. Right? The Denver Nuggets are the best example of a team that a pick and roll, like in isolation, is okay, we can run this whenever we want, right? This is option C, but option A, option B, we can get a lot nastier than that. And I'm really hoping that the Raptors can too, because ultimately, if they started plays late, they'd start plays 16 seconds on the shot clock, which that's not where the league is going either. And they'd run they run a lot of tasty stuff, don't get me wrong. But if that broke down after 6 seconds, they'd have 10 seconds left and they'd run an isolation, a post up, or just a two-man pick and roll with three guys standing still. That was, I don't know what, 60% of possessions last year. That's just I doubt that's what Rajakovic wants to see. I doubt that's what he sold ownership and Masai Ujiri in those meetings. And I doubt that's the best way to optimize Scottie Barnes and the other players on the team. Um, Offense is a fleeting thing in that you can try to plan ahead, but the league is going to be different immediately when you unfold. And I guarantee, as a result of how the Denver Nuggets are scoring the basketball in these finals, the league's going to be different next year in how they play offense. It is no longer a high pick and roll 100 times a game league. I mean, if it ever was. And the teams that are most innovating are the teams that are least doing that. So really hope the Raptors get to join that crew.
I think also what your example kind of spells out is that the teams that do well are the teams that are built around their talent.
Yeah.
And because Philadelphia Philadelphia and Phoenix running a lot of pick and roll does not mean they're doing it wrong. It means that
No.
that's the talent on the roster, and vice versa. Like, why would the Sacramento Kings have Domantas Sabonis sidling up to players and trying to like flip screens and do all that kind of stuff when he can, with a live dribble, track a defender and throw a pass behind his back into
Yep.
space that he knows is unoccupied for Malik Monk to come off of because he's a burner from three or getting all the way to the rim or making the spray to the same corner that Demonis just dribbled up from because a player's relocated there. Like, that is just a much better play. And some guys like James Harden revels in the guy sidling up there because it gives him the interplay at the point of attack. The Raptors are a team that don't have that inherent dominant pick and roll player or dominant pick and roll big. They have to do piecemeal and they have to find different advantages. My earnest hope is that Darko will help guide that and the guys will buy in. Something that we're not going to talk so much about is defense. And I'll just say this here. My promise to you is that I will be asking about that tomorrow. And I will also be asking about what Darko said to Masai so that Masai was like, this is the guy who's going to be here, who's going to help turn the tide. And then we'll see how much info we get from either of those questions, whether I'm the one asking them or whether, it's whoever asking them, because pressers are a communal activity. Everybody chimes in. You look like you have something to say, Lewis.
The league is a reactive league right now.
Mm-hmm.
The Raptors just lost one of the most humiliating games I've ever seen a few months ago because they have all the proactive tools in the bag, but they could not react when a shift was thrown their way. And this is credit to Ben Taylor, Thinking Basketball. He introduced this idea to me in his podcast about James Harden, saying Harden, is maybe the best in the league at going in the lab and saying, if this happens, how do I respond to it? Unbelievable proactive player. But in many ways, he was thrown off and has been thrown off in a number of playoffs when the defense just says, okay, what if we do something you haven't seen before? And he doesn't have the time to go plan and react in that individual moment. And it defangs him in many ways. And so did it with the Raptors. Fred VanVleet, for all his abilities, when the Chicago Bulls switched Nikola Vucevic onto him, that should be a win for the Raptors.
Yeah.
And instead, that eliminated them from the postseason. And if there's one thing that I hope on a really micro X's and O's scale, it's how do the Raptors become a better reactive team? How do they respond to changes in a way that converts something that should be an advantage into points?
It's pretty shocking. You want to talk about 0.5 or something like that. If
Yeah.
Fred gets Vucevic on him and Fred is like, I guess I'm not the guy who beats, a mediocre foot speed big man on the perimeter, which it stinks a little bit that he's not, but why aren't you immediately triggering an action with Pascal that, like, throw it to him and go run over there for what
Yeah.
maybe it's a ghost screen or maybe you plant it, but like
Yeah.
involve
Run
Vucevic
some get
in a
action.
motion action, something like that. Why isn't that like immediately? And the
Yeah.
Raptors kind of everybody looking and be like, okay, I guess it's the switch. Like, what happens now? That slow
Yeah.
realization, born that day, every possession, like, oh, because they're so comfortable letting the possession get to those same rote,
Yeah.
processes. Players think they can do anything. And they can. Players can do
Humans.
anything. Humans think
Humans
they
think
can
we
do
can do
anything.
anything.
Correct. And players think they can do anything within their discipline, which they are the best in the world at. Correctly so. At the NBA level, a lot of what it is not can you do it? It's at what percentile can you do it? And is that a feasible return? If Fred will score on Vucevic, he will, but is there something better on the floor and get to it quickly is something that the Raptors not we're using that example as like that's the example, but this was emblematic of many different things. We're not going to talk that much defense. The Raptors defense I think should be pretty inherent if provided that they're bringing a lot of the same guys back and it was the 6th ranked defense after the All-Star break. I think that Darko coming into this has to be looking like I'm an offensive guy. I've spent a lot of time dealing with offensive systems, and there's a lot of defensive talent on this team, a mixture of what the things he knows about defense that hasn't spoken into the ether, good assistant coaches, presumably, and the defensive talent on the roster should hopefully get that settled. We don't know
Yeah.
that much about it, though. What we have heard about is development. As we said at the start of the podcast, development has been a huge pillar of Darko's career. Not only that, it was where he began developing himself as a coach because he was
Yep.
16 and said, I'm going to do coaching instead. And not only that, he was coaching youth players, but that he got, a promotion and it was back to youth. And then he got a promotion overseas and it was the D League. And then he was dealing with, and that he kept going back to be a summer league coach. And that players like Desmond Bain and Zaire Williams and Michael Bridges, just to name a few, have spoken about him ad nauseum and how much he's helped their game. Development for a team such as the Raptors that has struggled with it, not given guys much playing time. What do you think about him from that point of view?
Yeah, so I thought his description of it was really unique. And I just want to say this is I have another job. I also tutor. Um, and teaching, I've taught, basically my whole life.
LSAT
Um,
tutor, one of the best. You can look him up on Google for anybody.
okay, all right. But teaching is the same no matter what you're teaching. I've taught a million different things. And what you're doing is you're just connecting with people. You find out who they are as people, who they are as learners. You have to find unique ways to explain things, all sorts of different ways. I love teaching, but I actually was surprised by his description of teaching. So this is again from Global Stars. He was talking about focusing on one skill at a time, which to me is not self-explanatory. So I actually thought that was really unique. He talked about a lot of review, co-creation, meeting with players um, to go over, process, whether players are happy with, how it's being developed, what they'd like to add, subtract. And I loved his idea. Don't focus on results, focus on players, because then the results will take care of themselves. That's all great. But focusing on one skill at a time was really unique to me. And not from how I understand the NBA does development. They do like a lot of different things. So um, I'm curious if that is, if you think that's different from how the NBA usually does things. Uh, but that stood out.
I think that makes sense. I've done, I guess, intermediate basketball skill development, I would say, as a player. I've been to the ID camps for college tryouts. I've been to some of the high level camps during high school. And a lot of, yeah, this guy is just, and a lot of what they're doing is like baseline, trying to create a baseline, trying to see what you excel at. But I think it does make sense at the highest level when there's already a very firm baseline created, and especially in scrimmages, in live games, you're going to just baseline is always going to be something, and you're always going to be introduced to new stimuli that creates, we talked about how, it's the technical versus the player innovation. Like, players innovate without even thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think that's why that's important, is focusing on one thing. Is like, you develop one skill, and that isn't a skill, that's a branch. Like, that's a tree. They call it a skill tree in a video game for a reason, right? Is like, because a skill tree grows branches. And when you give that's why they call, like, for guys who can't shoot but have a bunch of other burgeoning skills, like shooting is their swing skill, because suddenly a bunch of these different things become viable once you do shoot. I think it makes a ton of sense to try and develop one thing, because if you develop one thing and it becomes an NBA level skill, then that opens up a million other things that you'll passively start learning and getting better at. We see this with like Jason Tatum, pretty good at making a lot of reads that are based around driving gravity. Like, he makes a lot of great reads when he collapses the defense. But as far as a defense who's being really proactive and trying to get the ball out of his hands, he hasn't seen as much of that lately. And so what he does is makes really simple, basic reads out of that, because he still hasn't that branch of his skill tree hasn't grown out that much because it's like initiation, manipulation. It's not evident based out of like driving gravity. And Darko being like, we're going to build one thing and you just have to be able to do that, I think is the best way to go about it. Now, I'm just a schmuck. These are my I'm throwing darts, right? Um I'm trying my best to put myself in those shoes, but I think that does make sense to me given what I know, which admittedly is very little.
Admittedly, schmuck. So the Raptors have a lot of
An admitted
guys
schmuck. Yeah.
who need to shoot. Does that one thing then? It's just like everyone goes to shooting camp because we already
Oh, we
had the
got
Nick
Nick
Nurse.
Nurse over here. Yeah.
So here's my question: what happens to the Nick Nurse shooting school, like the night school? Are all those years? What like are they just going to pick up where they? What happens?
See, this is the thing. Like when Pascal was shooting really well in the 2019-20 season, everybody was like, "Hey, what the hell did you do with this guy?" And he's like, "Hey, it's an 18-month program. We'll see how he's doing at the end,
That's
but it
right.
looks pretty good right now." I don't know why that's my Nick Nurse. But anyway, yeah, I I don't know what happens, but I'm gonna be honest with you. Nobody was ever going to the Nick Nurse shooting school. Nobody was in attendance, man. That just Nick Nurse was teaching regular people how to shoot because an NBA player isn't buying his book or the pill.
Yeah.
Um, so I'll tell you one thing. Nick Nurse might be able to say like, "Hey, we're trying to get your palms like at practice." Maybe it's Pascal, and he notices something. He's like, Pascal, like you're tucking your elbow. I know we want to tuck the elbow a bunch, but you're bringing in a little bit, and it's creating, your palm alignment is off, and like palm alignment is everything. We think about Jamal Murray, who I coach at Team CAD, and he gets a little bit bowed, but there's great palm alignment. That's where the ball's coming off of. Something like that. That's coaching. That's going to be in there. That's valuable. But as far as like sitting down with each player and like let's rebuild your jump shot, that's not Nick Nurse. That's a
Yeah.
team of guys. That's not only Pascal, the guys he works with the Raptors, for example, but that's Pascal's own team who has ideas about his
Yeah.
development.
And Jim San.
Right. So like I just I don't I don't know what skill Darko picks for each guy. Shooting has to be on everybody's like little checklist. But my hope is that for a guy who, if you go watch some of his like, I'm Darko Rajakovic and I'm walking through a practice, he's really talking about, this is the stab step to get around a screen. This is the way we want to do it. Um, Teaching skills that are also in concert with your promoted schemes is important. Maybe it's not best for the players necessarily. It's there's a few Bucks guys who came into the league, Dante DiVincenzo, who's like, oh wow, I actually have really good acumen with playing, lock and trail because
Yeah.
I have played with Brooke Lopez and Giannis Antetokounmpo my whole life, and then they bring him to a team where it's like, we want you to beat a guy in front of the screen. We're gonna ice a bunch. He's like, maybe I'm not so good at that. So that's where the coaching and development can intersect. And those are questions that I don't really know, but hopefully we see results.
Wait, are you to tell me that they're not going to get their degrees after all these years in the shooting university? Uh, it's
Dwayne
like a
Wade got a
strike.
degree. He got a degree from Harvard in like 2 days. I'm sure you can get a Nick Nurse shooting degree in 25 minutes or something like that. Like something you
Yeah,
print
yeah,
off
yeah.
on a printer.
One of those PhDs in organizational leadership.
One of those, yeah, something like that. I get a PhD in like nepotism or something like that. It just says nepotism on it. I think that'd be pretty good.
There are a lot, like, Masai Ujiri talked about the young guys not developing the way that the team wanted in the press conference the day that they let go of Nick Nurse. Uh, and I do think in many ways, we talked about Scottie Barnes, but Precious Achua is the one of the swing players that could determine the future of this team.
Can we hold that thought really quickly? I'm so sorry. I wanted to bring this up. Talking about keeping defenses off balance, this is the pick and roll thing. when you set up really deliberate pick and rolls, it shows the defense a lot of the times where they can pre-rotate from, which is why uh, Darko like to kind of put actions into offenses that aren't necessarily built around that. You want, because a pick and roll has a bunch of action, a bunch of decisions that come after the defensive response to it. So the defense gets to kind of set the tone in that regard. But if you run actions that are more so based out of like Chicago or something like that, you can have your reactions and stuff like that, and particularly like off-ball cuts that are built around how they defend at the point of attack. So that's like a just an important thing. He doesn't like spoken ideals once again, but he doesn't like to just belabor the pick and roll because it gives the defense an insight into how they want to defend, and then they get to set the tone. You can see Boston versus Miami, Game 7, where Al Horford was the guy, deciding what happened on their possessions like 18 times in the first 25 possessions, and it went terribly. Okay, Precious Achua, who's great and we love. So sorry.
Yes. So no, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think the way that the team handled Precious Achua last season was kind of a disaster.
It sucked, dude.
Yeah.
Oh, I hate
And
everybody who listens to this podcast knows I hated it.
if there's one thing that well, I've said that so many times. If there's one of the 8 things that I hope from this new coaching staff, and we'll see who fills it out because this isn't all on the head coach, a lot of it's assistants. I really hope that that they handle Precious Achua differently, that there's a lot more kindness, forgiveness for mistakes. Rajakovic did talk about he doesn't want film sessions to be negative, um, which I hope that is the case because I think there was a lot of criticism of players like Achua, Chris Boucher, Gary Trent. He doesn't fit with this team without forcing turnovers. I think there could be more kindness with players who are making mistakes. And I'm really hoping Achua, if he is supported more, is able to bring more of his skill set to the court because if Toronto can't, they're looking at a really, really shallow group of skills across the roster.
I will say, just to hammer home perhaps the well, okay. I really hope for good things for Precious as well. And I think that his growth and development is paramount. And from the terrible team building aspect, the fact that he hasn't really popped off yet, and the Raptors could get him on, a decent extension with all the, what's the term, latent skills that he has. That could end up being great. I'm writing a piece right now about comparing 2013 and 2023, and the fact that the Raptors had Kyle Lowry on an extension where he was like 16%, 13%, 12% of the cap while being the best point guard in the East over a decade. It ended up being pretty important for team building. So
Yep.
just as like Precious looms large in my heart and in the team's team building stuff. What we should do now, compare and contrast Nick Nurse and Darko. Can I take the lead?
Take it, baby.
I spoke about this a little bit at the start. Lip service versus the reality of how things are actually happening. Nick Nurse can say he's the player's coach. Nick Nurse can preach, I'm doing this for the guys. Nick Nurse can preach all of those things. And while he certainly can feel that way, how that's being received, and then the chemistry of the locker room, not only coach player, but coach player player.
Yep.
There are, you know, there are reactions that are being had, ripple effects. And Nick, it was patently clear to everybody who was covering the team. It was patently clear to many people around the league. It was patently clear to a lot of fans, even, that there's a disconnect somewhere and there is some dislike between certain people of other people, and this stuff festered. And, as you mentioned, Nick is a world class coach in some regards. That is undeniable. But it's tough to buy in for a guy who you're like, damn, like this guy is, chewing me out in media. This guy isn't putting me in positions where I think I can be my best. This guy is asking a lot of everybody all the time. We play the hardest brand of basketball in the league. We've been doing it for 4 years. Um, my career is about me. And the team isn't doing well. The team is playing, a little bit more of a self-centered brand of basketball. Why would I buy into anything like this? Stuff has far-reaching impact. And so Darko is a guy who has never been a head coach, and it's easier to be an assistant coach than it is to be a head coach. It's a lot easier as an assistant, like Earl Watson was to Pascal Siakam, to be the liaison, to be the guy who comes to you and says, like, hey, having some trouble here. Let's talk about it. You can good guy it, good cop it, whatever term you want to use, all the live long day. Darko has never had to be the head coach. And so he's going to have to learn some things. But the track record, knowing a few guys around the league that have been, worked with Darko in proximity, as far as like in the basketball operations, they've said great things about him. This has also been reported by other people who presumably know different people than I do, meaning there's a wide net of people who say, like, this guy's great. And as far as testimonials from players for an assistant coach, they're not that common. Like a lot of assistant coaches aren't that available to media, which means players just have to kind of offer that stuff up.
Yeah.
And Darko is a guy who has had many people offer it up. He's been lauded for his approach, his humanity, and his intelligence. And while Nick certainly has been lauded for many of those things in the past, that's some of those things stopped being hallmarks of his approach. And that's the biggest difference between the two, because there are similarities in how they got here. There are similarities in their uh, spoken ideals. But most importantly, guys got to like you. You know, that's just what it has to be, or respect what you're saying, or both, ideally.
Yeah. There was definitely a switch over Nick Nurse's time as a coach of the Raptors. In his rookie year when they won a championship, Kawhi Leonard saying, fuck that, let's get both. Uh, you know, the BBL stories, that stuff was cool. That stuff really rung a bell with media, with players. He was a phenomenal coach. There was certainly stuff behind the scenes. I mean, Kyle Lowry even said in an interview, if you knew what else happened, and Nick, I think, said it was after the game one of the playoffs against Orlando. And he was like, yeah, that was one of the 3 times I yelled all year. There was a camaraderie to the team with Nick Nurse as a rookie head coach. And that camaraderie was not there by 2022, 2023. The BBL stories probably were not as significant if they were still being told, because I'm sure he said them all. It's just the I think coaches have a shelf life in the NBA, the vast majority of them, and the type of players change, generational change, and it's hard to relate with players as on a human level that are 30 years younger than you, and then 10 years later that are 40 years younger than you, because you keep aging and players keep staying the same age. And it's really hard to be, an NBA head coach. So I don't think any of this is a failing of Nick Nurse. I think a lot of stuff is just difficult. And even if Rajakovic is not all of these phenomenal things, I'm sure he is, right? All of these laudatory things, it's just easier to be a first year head coach. It's just a lot easier to meet guys for the first time. There's no friction yet. And so, at the bare minimum, you can expect to see more patience between the coaching staff and the players.
Especially since you can look at, and this is kind of what we talked about, how point 0.5 spacing, like ooh, these are interesting aspects of basketball to draw advantage from that people aren't really addressing, that there are parallels to, and, cutting teeth in the D League,
Yeah.
taking, this long, global approach to getting to the point where they are today. Nurse and Darko have a lot of similarities in that regard. And while that may be true, when Darko goes to practice and says, "These are my ideals," and it clicks for the first time when they run it, it wouldn't be like the nurse practice where they ran his thing and it clicked for the 88th time, but it was whatever. Like
Yeah.
that, it's human. It matters.
Yep.
The fresh voice, getting something new, like a new good thing is better than like a regular good thing. Everybody, you can't avoid that bias in your head. And that is why, you talk about like, was the Nick Nurse thing a failure? Was it an inevitability? There were failures on his part, on his behalf. Everyone makes interpersonal failures, has them.
Yep.
But of course, it's an inevitability. One of the greatest players of all time, Larry Bird, has a quote specifically like, "Nah, NBA coaches last this long. That's it.
Yeah.
Then they're done." And that's Larry Bird. While that doesn't make the rule, it certainly can lend to the idea that perhaps it applies across, a lot of different places. Greg Popovich and Eric Spoelstra are very unique, and it's not like they're cut from the same cloth. One of them is spent time in the military, and the other one spent time as a video coordinator, and and had family in the Heat organization. Like that's just really different as far as
Yep.
approach, and they've both through different means had a tremendous amount of staying power and success. Is Darko the next one of those? Probably not. Is he expected to be? Definitely not. But what he is for sure is the Raptors' next head coach. Anything you want to say about Darko before we get out of here?
I'm excited, man. I just on a personal level, when the season ended, I was very ready for it to be over. There was a lot of writing about the same thing because a lot of the same thing kept on happening over and
We
over
did it
again.
all, man. It was covered. We said it.
And I am excited to write about something new. And, the fact that people seem really optimistic and positive, all the better because I thrive in optimistic and positive situations.
And again, to lean into the on the personal level, as a guy who, when I go to that scrum, when I go to that presser, the question I ask, and oftentimes the question you ask, is the question that only you or I would ask that day.
Yeah.
And a lot of it revolves around like, please, coach, give me a morsel, just like a little chunk. I want to write about this cool thing that I noticed. Will you please give me a look into it? Darko is a guy who I don't know if the PR is going to say, like, hey, 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 and then
We'll find out.
everything gets shut off. We'll see. But he's been such a nerd who's been so open and willing to talk about basketball, the minutia, the little concepts that I'm like, man, maybe I'll get an opportunity because Nurse did not like that.
Yeah.
And my fingers are crossed for that. And if that isn't the case, then we'll get to write about all the new stuff on the Raptors, and
Just without
hopefully
quotes.
just without quotes. Maybe if Delano's on the team, he'll still give me. I'll still be able to get some play names out of him or something like that. But Lewis, anything to say to people before we get out of here?
No, it's I got nothing. I appreciate as always the chance to pal around with you, buddy. These podcasts are always super fun.
We love palling around, don't we? For podcast listeners who are interested in coverage, I'm if nobody asks them, I don't know how many questions I'm going to get to ask these guys tomorrow. But I wonder if Darko, like, hey Darko, are you going to coach the summer league team? Maybe that's something you do. He's done it like 4 times in his past. Maybe I'll be in Vegas and I'll be hopefully talking to all I'll be this year's version of when people are like, "Hey, Stanley Johnson, you're OG Ananobi." I'll witness that, whatever this year's version of that is, and then all the other cool stuff. So I'll have a ton of interesting stuff coming out about the Raptors over the course of the summer, and on draft night. Come out to the Raptors Republic draft party. I'll be podcasting from there. If you've ever wanted to be on a Raptors Republic podcast, I'll be bringing people on to talk to them, provided watch your profanity or something like that. But yeah, if anybody wants to come out and hang out and have a little bit of Raptors community going on, that's a
I'll
good
be
thing.
there, but drinking and not podcasting. So you can come do that with me too.
Yes, yeah. Just if you want to hang out, that's Lewis and I probably spend more time on this stuff than the listener or reader. But at the end of the day, we're all just schlubs and we want to talk about basketball same as you. So we can all do that together. Thanks for listening to us, schlubs that we are. And whether you got into this in the morning or at night, have a blessed day and goodbye.